What if the First World War did not begin with gunshots, speeches, or outrage, but with infrastructure quietly redrawing incentives long before anyone noticed? History textbooks begin in Sarajevo because it feels personal. A man, a weapon, a moment. But empires do not operate at the scale of moments. They operate at the scale of systems. They react not to emotions, but to disruptions in control. Energy moved at Britain's pace. Distance was a tax Britain collected. Then, quietly, a proposal appeared on the map. Not a weapon system, not an alliance, a railway, a continuous overland route linking Central Europe to the Middle East, designed to function without British ships, British canals, or British permission. Steel replacing water, geography bypassing navy, a logistical idea with political consequences. And in the years before 1914, something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface of global power. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire did not rule because it was more moral or more civilized. It ruled because it controlled movement, sea lanes, choke points, ports, time itself. Trade flowed where Britain allowed it to flow. This was not a future threat. It was a structural one. Because once infrastructure is built, it cannot be argued with. It does not negotiate. It simply changes incentives. It alters who depends on whom. The question then is not why Europe went to war in 1914. The question is why a train line triggered strategic panic in London years earlier. Because when an empire's control over movement is challenged, violence is rarely the first response. First come delays, then financial pressure, then narrative framing, and only when those fail does war become acceptable not as a mistake, but as a correction. This story does not begin with an assassination, it begins with a map. What we are usually told about the origins of World War I is that no one wanted it, that alliances hardened, diplomacy failed, and Europe stumbled forward without intention. This explanation sounds reasonable until you examine who benefited from the outcome. Accidents rarely preserve existing hierarchies, systems do. By the early 20th century, Britain's dominance did not rest on territorial size or population. It rested on circulation, goods, capital, information, and energy moved through channels Britain either owned or controlled. The Royal Navy enforced those channels at sea. The Suez Canal compressed global distance into a narrow point of leverage. This was not ideology. It was infrastructure. Whoever controlled movement controlled outcomes. Seen through that lens, the question changes. The issue was never whether nationalism in the Balkans might ignite violence. That kind of instability was constant. The real variable was whether the global system Britain managed could be bypassed, and by the late 19th century, that possibility was no longer theoretical. Germany's unification in 1871 altered Europe's internal balance. Within decades, it became the continent's most productive industrial economy. But productivity without access is a constraint. Germany's exports moved through sea lanes dominated by another power. Its imports were vulnerable to blockade. Its growth depended on infrastructure it did not control. That dependence was tolerable until an alternative appeared. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire was being dismantled financially. In 1881, bankruptcy transferred control of its revenues to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, administered by British and French interests. Taxes collected inside the empire no longer serve local development. They serve as foreign creditors. The state remained sovereign in name, but its economic bloodstream flowed outward. These two pressures, German industrial confinement and Ottoman fiscal subjugation, did not collide by chance. They aligned structurally. One needed access. The other needed autonomy. The solution that emerged was not diplomatic. It was logistical. A railway does not argue. It does not threaten. It simply reorganizes incentives. Once built, it changes what is cheap, what is fast, and what is possible. It reduces dependence invisibly. And for a system built on dependence, that is destabilizing. From London's perspective, this was not a regional development project. It was a silent revision of global power. The danger was not immediate conflict. It was gradual irrelevance. And when faced with that trajectory, the question for an empire is never whether war is tragic. The question is whether delay is more dangerous than disruption. This is where the textbook narrative breaks down. Europe did not drift toward war blindly. It moved within a system reacting to a structural threat, one measured not in speeches or alliances, but in steel, distance, and time. To understand why a railway mattered this much, you have to step back into how the world actually functioned before it existed. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire did not dominate because it owned everything. It dominated because it decided how everything moved. The Royal Navy enforced maritime circulation at a global scale, but ships alone were not enough. Control required compression of time, of distance, of dependency. That compression had a name: the Suez Canal. Opened in 1869, Suez transformed geography into leverage. Routes that once took months were reduced to weeks. India became reachable through a narrow passage Britain could monitor, protect, and if necessary, deny. Trade with East Asia followed the same logic. Whoever passed through Suez entered a system governed by British rules: insurance, pricing, and timing. This was not symbolic power. It was mechanical. The empire functioned because global trade had to pass through its infrastructure. While Britain stabilized the system at sea, the balance on land was shifting. Germany's unification in 1871 created a state with extraordinary internal capacity. By the 1890s, German factories were producing more than Britain's. German chemical firms set industrial standards. German science drove technological change. But output without access creates pressure. Germany had production, but no secure channels to move it globally. Its economy depended on routes controlled by a rival power. In a maritime system, Germany was structurally exposed to the southeast. The Ottoman Empire faced a different constraint. Once a multi-continental power, it had been reduced to a weakened state burdened by external debt. In 1881, bankruptcy formalized that weakness. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration assumed control over key revenues, directing taxes from salt, tobacco, and silk away from local governance and toward European creditors. The empire retained borders and a ruler, but it lost discretion. Its economy operated under external supervision. These conditions did not create crisis overnight. They created dependency. Germany depended on sea access it could not secure. The Ottomans depended on financial structures they did not control. Both were embedded in a system designed elsewhere. And systems like this remain stable until someone attempts to exit them. Railways mattered because they offered an exit that did not require confrontation. Overland infrastructure does not challenge a navy directly, and it renders it less relevant. Each kilometer of track reduces reliance on maritime chokepoints. Each station shifts the balance between distance and speed. For an empire built on controlling circulation, that shift was not marginal. It was cumulative. Before the first rail was laid, the logic was already visible. A land-based route connecting Central Europe to the Middle East would not overthrow British power overnight. It would erode it quietly, and erosion, for an empire, is more dangerous than attack. From the Ottoman perspective, the problem was no longer abstract. An empire cannot defend territory it cannot reach. By the reign of Abdul Hamid II, distance inside the empire had become a liability. Moving troops from Constantinople to the eastern provinces took months. Supplying frontier garrisons drained resources faster than they could be replaced. Reform without mobility was cosmetic. Railways were not a modernization project. They were an attempt to restore internal coherence, but the choice of partner mattered. British and French financing was available, but it came with oversight, concessions, and long-term dependence. Control of revenue followed capital. The Ottomans had already experienced that mechanism in 1881. Accepting more of the same would only deepen external supervision. Germany's offer differed not because it was generous, but because its incentives aligned differently. Germany did not need to manage the Ottoman economy, it needed access. The logic behind the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was straightforward. Connect Central Europe to Constantinople. Extend the line through Anatolia into Mesopotamia. Terminate near the Persian Gulf. Once completed, the route would function independently of maritime power. Goods could move without passing British-controlled sea lanes. Troops could redeploy internally without delay. The system reduced exposure rather than confronting it. What transformed the railway from a regional project into a global concern was energy. By the early 20th century, naval power was transitioning from coal to oil. Oil extended range, increased speed, and reduced refueling time. British planners understood this shift clearly, but Britain lacked domestic oil reserves. Its navy depended on external supply. Mesopotamia, by contrast, was emerging as an oil-rich region, and the planned railway corridor passed directly through it. German-backed agreements secured mineral rights extending 20 kilometers on either side of the track. This detail mattered. Infrastructure determines not only movement, but access. If the railway reached the Persian Gulf, Germany would not simply trade through the Middle East, it would sit alongside the resource base that powered modern fleets. Control would not be total, but influence would be structural. At that point, the railway ceased to be a commercial venture. It became a systemic threat, not because it promised immediate domination, but because it introduced redundancy into a system that relied on monopoly. British sea power could withstand rivals. It could not tolerate irrelevance. And once redundancy enters the system, escalation becomes a matter of timing rather than intention. The rails did not declare war. They made war conceivables. Once British planners accepted that the railway could not be neutralized by delay alone, their response followed a familiar imperial pattern. Direct confrontation was unnecessary. The system offered quieter tools. The first move targeted geography. At the southern end of the proposed route sat Kuwait, a small coastal territory whose importance derived entirely from location. Britain secured a discreet agreement with the Sheikh of Kuwait restricting foreign access to land without British consent. No announcements were made, no construction was halted, but the railway's endpoint was effectively removed. A system designed to reach the Persian Gulf now terminated inland, disconnected from maritime trade. The second move addressed perception. British media reframed the project in moral terms. The railway was no longer discussed as infrastructure, but as an extension of authoritarian rule. The Ottoman state was portrayed as backward. German involvement was cast as complicity. This reframing served a practical purpose. It reduced political resistance to intervention by redefining opposition as responsibility. Infrastructure became suspect, not because of what it did, but because of who benefited. The third move was financial. London remained the central node of global capital. Access to credit, insurance, and investment flowed through institutions Britain influenced. Participation in the railway project became more difficult. Funding slowed, costs rose, delays accumulated. The goal was not cancellation, it was uncertainty. Large systems fail more often from friction than force. Despite this, construction continued. German engineers pushed through the Taurus Mountains, a terrain that had resisted control for centuries. Tunnels were blasted through rock. Tracks extended eastward across desert. Each completed segment reduced Britain's margin for error. By the early 1910s, the project no longer existed only in reports. It existed physically, embedded in the landscape. By 914, the railway was not finished, but it was close enough to matter. Close enough to change calculations, close enough to make existing tools insufficient. At that stage, the remaining options narrowed. Financial pressure could slow the future, but not eliminate it. Diplomatic obstacles could divert it, but not reverse it. For an empire dependent on controlling circulation, that realization carries a specific implication. When a structural threat cannot be absorbed, it must be reset. And resetting a system at that scale rarely occurs without war. When war began in 1914, Britain's strategic behavior clarified what had been implicit all along. The first decisive moves were not concentrated on Germany's industrial core or the European front alone. Attention shifted immediately toward the Middle East. British forces landed in Basra, officially to secure oil facilities at Abadan. In practice, the landing marked the start of a race. The objective was not symbolic victory, it was positional control. From Basra, British troops moved north along the same corridor the unfinished railway was meant to dominate. Mosul, Kirkuk, oil-bearing regions that sat at the intersection of energy supply and overland transport. Securing these areas ensured that even if the railway were completed, its strategic value would be neutralized. Control of resources would precede control of routes. The Ottoman leadership, facing collapse, aligned with Germany under a rational assumption. A German victory promised an end to British and French financial supervision imposed. After 1881, debt could be renegotiated, sovereignty restored. The railway would be the backbone of this transformation, but infrastructure operates on timelines that war does not forgive. The railway was incomplete where it mattered most. In the Taurus Mountains, gaps in the track forced a break in the system. Supplies arriving from Germany had to be unloaded, moved over mountain passes by truck or camel, then reloaded onto rail on the other side. Each transfer multiplied delay, ammunition stalled, food spoiled, reinforcements arrived late. What should have been a continuous flow became a sequence of interruptions. Logistics, not courage, determined outcomes. Britain suffered setbacks. The siege of Kut ended with a full British surrender, a rare humiliation, but the system absorbed the loss. Britain could resupply by sea, reinforce indefinitely. Replace losses with industrial depth the Ottomans no longer possessed. Over time, the imbalance asserted itself. British forces regrouped, advanced, and captured Baghdad. Jerusalem followed. The pattern was consistent. Sea power outlasted land constraints. Blockade outperformed rail. The railway's promise remained theoretical because it arrived incomplete. And while soldiers advanced and retreated, another process continued uninterrupted. Diplomats planned, administrators drafted, maps were prepared for a post-war order that assumed Ottoman defeat as a logistical certainty rather than a political question. By the time the fighting slowed, the railway had already lost the race it was built to win, not because the idea was flawed, but because timing had turned infrastructure into a bottleneck instead of a solution. The war did not destroy the railway. It simply revealed that unfinished systems are liabilities when confronted by mature ones. Before the war ended, its outcome in the Middle East had already been converted into geometry. In 1916, Britain and France treated the collapse of the Ottoman Empire not as a future possibility, but as an administrative certainty. Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot did not debate cultures or histories. They worked with maps. Pencils moved where rail corridors, ports, and resource zones suggested they should. What emerged was not a peace plan, it was a control diagram. The new borders ignored tribal networks, religious continuity, and economic ecosystems that had existed for centuries. Those variables were irrelevant to the system being designed. What mattered was segmentation. The territory that once functioned as a connected landmass was divided into compartments. Each compartment would depend outward rather than inward. No single authority would control the full overland route linking Europe to the Persian Gulf again. The logic was mechanical. Break continuity, and movement slows. Introduce borders, and logistics fracture. Customs posts replace stations. Currencies replace shared circulation. The railway that once promised integration now encountered political joints at every turn. The same infrastructure that alarmed Britain became the reference point for dismantling its potential. On the ground, this process unfolded alongside military and covert action. Arab revolts were encouraged against Ottoman control, supplied and guided to target transport lines. Bridges were destroyed. Tracks were sabotaged. The railway, still incomplete, was turned into a liability rather than an asset. Its physical presence made it an obvious target. The promise of independence accompanied these actions, but it was never embedded into the system being built. When the war ended, those promises dissolved. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled. The Sultan was removed. The Caliphate was abolished. Yet the financial structure established after the 1881 bankruptcy did not disappear. Debt obligations were transferred to the newly created states. Economic dependence survived regime change. Sovereignty was partitioned, but accountability remained external. What replaced the empire was not stability, but managed fragmentation. States were designed to be viable only within a framework overseen by outside powers. Infrastructure no longer served regional integration. It served extraction and control. The railway was divided among multiple jurisdictions, none of which could operate it as a unified system. The train never reached the sea, and without that connection, the region's internal coherence was never restored. The map itself became the final mechanism, quiet, durable, and far more effective than armies at preventing the return of a single, continuous corridor of power. The end of the First World War did not end the logic that produced it. The system adjusted, but the incentives remained intact. During the Second World War, Germany again looked east, drawn by the same variables that had shaped its strategy decades earlier: oil, land access, and insulation from maritime blockade. The geography had not changed. Neither had Britain's response. British forces moved into Iraq once more, securing energy infrastructure and transport corridors before they could be leveraged by a rival. Different uniforms, identical priorities. After 1945, Britain no longer had the capacity to manage the system it had designed. Debt and exhaustion forced retreat. But the structure did not collapse. It was transferred. The United States inherited responsibility for maintaining a global order built on controlled circulation, sea lanes, energy routes, choke points. The underlying concern remained unchanged. No single power could be allowed to unify the Eurasian landmass through overland infrastructure beyond naval reach. This logic shaped the Cold War. Turkey's strategic value was not ideological. It was positional. It sat astride the same corridors that had once terrified British planners. NATO expansion followed geography before it followed politics. Alliances hardened where movement needed to be constrained. The objective was not conquest. It was denial of integration, of autonomy, of uninterrupted land-based flow. In the 21st century, the pattern reappeared in familiar form. A rising industrial power faced maritime vulnerability. Energy imports passed through narrow sea lanes, controlled by another navy. Exposure was structural. The response was predictable. Investment shifted inland. Railways expanded across borders. Pipelines reduced dependence on shipping routes. Ports, roads, and corridors were designed to function outside existing choke points. The Belt and Road Initiative did not introduce a new idea. It revived an old one at scale. Overland infrastructure as insurance, connectivity as leverage, redundancy as protection. And the reaction followed established lines. Projects were framed as financial traps. Strategic motives were questioned. Access to ports and terminals was restricted. Capital flows were scrutinized. Infrastructure was once again treated not as neutral development, but as a geopolitical instrument. The language changed. The mechanics did not. Control of movement remained the central variable. Empires still tolerated competition. They still resisted bypasses. And the fear remained consistent across a century that once a corridor exists, it cannot be unseen. It alters incentives permanently. The railway never stopped being dangerous. It simply learned how to return under a different name, in a different era, moving through the same geography that has always decided who depends on whom. There is a tendency to treat infrastructure as background. Roads fade into landscapes. Railways become lines on a map. Ports turn into neutral gateways. But infrastructure is never passive. It organizes dependence. It decides who waits, who moves, and who pays the cost of distance. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was not dangerous because it carried weapons or troops. It was dangerous because it proposed a different logic of circulation, a system where movement no longer required naval approval, where energy, goods, and authority could flow along land routes outside an existing hierarchy. That was the disruption. Everything that followed financial pressure, diplomatic obstruction, war, redrawn borders was a response to that structural shift. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because it modernized. It collapsed because its attempt to modernize intersected with another power's core dependency. The railway revealed a fault line. Once exposed, it was managed, fragmented, and neutralized. Not with a single decisive act, but through a sequence of adjustments designed to restore control over movement. That pattern did not disappear. It persisted because it works. When overland corridors threaten maritime dominance, resistance follows. When new routes reduce dependence on existing choke points, they attract scrutiny. When infrastructure creates alternatives, it is reframed as risk. The names change, the vocabulary evolves, the mechanics remain stable. Today's global tensions do not require moral interpretation to be understood. They require maps, trade routes, energy flows, transit times. The same questions are being asked again, quietly, in planning rooms rather than speeches. Who controls the corridor? Who depends on whom? What happens if dependence weakens? The Baghdad Railway never reached the sea to sea. But the logic that shaped its fate still governs how power reacts to connectivity. That is the recognition this history offers not closure, but orientation. Once you see the pattern, you stop looking for endings. You start watching where the next line is being drawn. Eat it.